Hello everyone, this is Miss Purnell, and today we're going to talk about the connection between housing, race, and class. And the first thing we need to establish is that in this country, wealth equals property. So owning property means that you can build wealth. In fact, if you picture the average family's assets as a pie, owning your own home makes up 30% of that pie. The next thing we need to establish is that wealth accumulates over time. So it's not necessarily just important whether your parents own the home that you live in, but it's also important to consider whether your grandparents own their home and whether their parents owned their home and whether their parents' parents owned their home. Because as homes get passed on, they lead to more homes and more property being built. A lot of the wealth that exists in this country today was built in the 1930s when a lot of homes were built and sold to soldiers coming back from the war. What began to happen at that time was something called redlining. And redlining is a process that people use to grade neighborhoods based on racial makeup. And here is an actual excerpt from a map of Boston that showed the red lines. And you can see that we have A is green, B is blue, that's the second grade, C is the third grade, it's yellow, and the further down you get from A to D, the more people of color lived in the neighborhood. So basically, people looked at the racial makeup. If there were more people of color, it got a lower grade. If it was almost all people of color, it got a red line around it. And what ended up happening after that was that if people went to a realtor or someone who was selling a home, the non-white people would get redlined. And what that means is that the white family would get to buy a home anywhere they wanted pretty much, while the non-white family had to buy a home or was only allowed to buy a home in that redlined area, in that area with only other people of color. Now, that might not seem like the biggest deal, but what happened after that was the redlined areas began to get some really bad treatment from the city. So what the city started to do was basically remove all their investments in the neighborhood. There was no more road repairs, there was less police, less maintenance of the libraries, the schools weren't maintained as well. People of color also faced difficulties even trying to get a home. There were less loans offered to people of color, and they had higher rates, so they're paying more for the same, or they just couldn't even get a loan. People of color, their home values decreased over time because they were in redlined areas that were being ignored by the city. So just to cover this one more time and make this connection really clear, in the 1930s, a lot of houses were built. People bought them. Banks gave white families a lot of good deals, whereas people of color did not end up getting good mortgages. Those houses were passed on within white families, and then white families' wealth increased. For people of color, if they were able to buy a home, the wealth or the worth of that home decreased over time, and a lot of people just weren't even able to buy a home. So for families of color, they were passed on homes that weren't worth much, and their wealth either stayed the same or went down. Important things to remember: this is not anyone's fault. No one who's living today set up these systems. Another important thing to remember is that we're exposing you to this information so we can hopefully expand your perspective in order to create change over time. So now that you understand how housing, race, and class are connected, you can kind of battle some stereotypes and spread this information to others.